Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this Friday afternoon. Really appreciate it. My name's Savannah Seidel. I'm the Vice President of Sustainability at Better Earth. So excited to have you all here with us and with Scott Faber from Environmental Working Group. Just want to start off with some boring housekeeping notes. If y'all could please remain on mute during the duration of the presentation, it'd be greatly appreciated. And please utilize the chat at any time. It's in that up right-hand corner there with that dialogue icon. Please use it and add in any notes or questions that you might have for Scott or myself throughout the conversation. We'll try to get to those questions at the end of our conversation. I also wanted to clarify one thing too, that this conversation, the intention of it, is to truly create space for a really important topic within our industry and for us as individual consumers. So this conversation isn't focused on Better Earth products or Better Earth's Clarion PFAS-free collection at this time. It's focused on creating that space for this conversation. So greatly appreciate your understanding there. We know there were some really awesome questions about our product line when people were registering. We have collected those questions and we'll be creating more resources and blog posts about those in the future. So thank you. And so with that out of the way, we'll dive in a bit deeper. So for those who aren't familiar with us, we're Better Earth and would love to introduce ourselves first. Better Earth is a sustainable packaging solutions company, and we exist to make sustainability more accessible. From field to fork to field, our mission is to close the loop. And so without further ado, I'd love to dive into the heart of the matter today, which is PFAS and the future of food service packaging. Many of you know that there's recent news and films like Mark Ruffalo's Dark Waters, for example, and growing legislation has led to increasing awareness and concern around polyfluorinated chemicals, otherwise known as PFAS, a general class of more than 5,000 chemicals. We're learning that PFAS are in just about everything from our makeup to disposable face masks to pots and pans to jeans and food service packaging. So at Better Earth, we are so thankful for the growing awareness, solutions, and leadership on addressing PFAS, and we want to help catalyze more and more conversation on it. This webinar is a part of that. And Better Earth is humbled to be joined by a true expert in the field, Scott Faber, Senior Vice President of Governmental Affairs at the Environmental Working Group. And over the next 30 minutes, Scott will walk us through what polyfluorinated chemicals are, how we got into the mess that we're in, why we should be concerned about these chemicals, and how governments are already beginning to take action. And then, of course, we'll save time at the end to better understand what taking action looks like, not just from the food service industry and being able to identify PFAS in our products, but also what we can do as individual consumers. And so before fully jumping in, Scott, I'd love if you could take a minute to elaborate further on your background and your unique background with the food service industry.
Yeah, well, thank you, Savannah. Thanks for inviting me. And so, hi everyone, Scott Faber with the Environmental Working Group. I've been at EWG for about 9 years. If you're not familiar with EWG, we're a national environmental health group that works on many issues, including advocacy around PFAS. We also provide a number of consumer guides. Some of you may be familiar with Skin Deep, our guide to cosmetics, and our guide to pesticides, our guide to cleaners, our guide to sunscreens, but we also have a great guide to packaged foods called Food Scores that ranks food not just on its nutritional quality, but also on the chemicals, at least the direct additives that are added to food. So a long history of working on food and agriculture and chemical policy, and all of those issues meet when it comes to PFAS. So really excited to be here with you all.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. And with that, I'd love to jump in, and we had some fun conversations when you and I were first connected around PFAS. And I've personally learned a lot when watching Mark Ruffalo's film Dark Waters. We actually, as a team, as a Better Earth team and some of our partners and friends in the industry, we got together for a community screening of the film, and it was really, it was hard to watch, but really enlightening. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit for the audience around how we got here. What are PFAS and what is its history?
Yeah, no, it's, I'm sure many of you know, and I highly recommend Dark Waters. I also highly recommend The Devil We Know, a documentary that's on Netflix. So as many of you know, PFAS are organofluorine compounds that include multiple fluorine atoms and at least one fully carbonated carbon atom. And it's this fluorine carbon bond that makes a PFAS a PFAS. And what makes PFAS so hard to break down, and it's why they're often referred to as forever chemicals. There are about 1,000 PFAS in commerce, about 600 of which are in EPA's active inventory of chemicals that they periodically update, and then about 400 that have entered commerce through a loophole in federal chemical law. Happy to explain that. Folks really want to dig into that. Those are the PFAS that are generally used in commerce, about 1,000. There are thousands more that have been created, but there are only about 1,000 that are typically used in commerce. And as Savannah said, they serve many purposes, probably best known for things that make our products waterproof or stain resistant, or to make pots and pans, of course, to help make food packaging, but they have many other applications in consumer products, like making your mascara waterproof, or and have many industrial applications. And for those of you who really are geeking out on PFAS, you may know that PFAS were actually invented by accident. They were invented by a chemist named Roy Plunkett, who was trying to make something else and accidentally invented PTFE in a laboratory in 1938. They've been used commercially since literally the 1950s. And in fact, the companies that were manufacturing and using PFAS knew by the 1950s that they could bind to our blood proteins. We knew by the 1960s that they were toxic to animals. We knew, in fact, the FDA, fun fact, rejected a food additive petition in 1966 over concerns around the toxicity of PFAS. We knew, the manufacturers of PFAS, I should say, knew by the 70s that PFAS was harming their own workers, and by the 70s that it had contaminated the blood of every American. Knew by the 80s that their plants were contaminating our water supplies. But what's so compelling about PFAS and why Dark Waters was such a hit movie is that no one else knew. The manufacturers of PFAS, the companies that made PFAS, that used PFAS, never told anyone else. They never told their workers. They never told their neighbors. And in violation of federal law, they never told their regulators. In fact, it's the case. We probably wouldn't know much, if anything, about PFAS if it were not for Rob Bilott, the lawyer who was featured in the movie Dark Waters. And it was because Rob represented a farmer whose cows were dying that he began through the process of legal discovery to learn what I've just shared, that companies had known for decades that these toxic fluorinated chemicals were contaminating all of us, but especially in this case, people who lived in and around Parkersburg, West Virginia.
And to that point, I really recommend folks go to Environmental Working Group's water database. After watching Dark Waters, you learn about Parkersburg, West Virginia, which is where the DuPont plant was that helped manufacture PFAS. And out of curiosity, I went to learn more about their public water toxicity. And PFAS was one of the top chemicals in their water supply today. So, I mean, talk about a forever chemical. I think that's really where it hit home for me. And then I learned more about Atlanta's water. And just kind of beginning to learn how lucky that we had it, that we just weren't in an area that had those types of chemicals being manufactured. And I think, that's a great transition, Scott, to this next big question, right? So clearly there's a lot of conversation about PFAS. You were just mentioning some of the ways that these companies went around their different stakeholders, from regulators to their own employees. And why should we be concerned? What have we begun to learn about this family of chemicals that has caused this red flag and caused it to become what's called a forever chemical?
Yeah, well, and thanks to the work of folks like Rob Bilott and then thousands of subsequent studies that have now been completed, we know that the exposure to PFAS increases the risk of kidney and testicular cancer, increases cholesterol levels, increases the risk of high blood pressure and preeclampsia in pregnant women, reduces infant birth weight, and on everyone's mind these days, reduces the effectiveness of vaccines. In fact, there was just a study that not only came out that addressed this question of the effectiveness of vaccines and the role of PFAS, but also raised questions about whether PFAS might make COVID more severe if you do get COVID-19. And a good resource on the health effects of PFAS are the extraordinarily in-depth toxicological profiles that have now been created by the Centers for Disease Control. And I think I'll just mention one thing about where we found PFAS. I think it's very troubling that we've so far detected PFAS in the drinking water in now more than 2,400 drinking water systems around the country. But that is really just a very partial picture, really a tip of the iceberg, because drinking water utilities are not yet required to test for PFAS. Some states have gone ahead and done their own testing. Some states have set their own drinking water standards. But by and large, we don't have even a complete picture. And frankly, if you probably tested your own water, you'd be surprised to see how much PFAS is in your own drinking water. So it's the health effects are well known. What is less well known is the sort of just how big the scope of this contamination problem is.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot of work being done about it, and it's actually a really nice segue again into this last question. And I know it's something that's on everybody's minds, both from as a conscious consumer, how governments are responding, since this is clearly a problem that's only getting bigger as our dependence on plastic grows, but also as representatives from the food service industry, how we can continue to be stewards and know what types of legislation are happening. I'm very curious, maybe we can start at the state level, and then also if there's any other federal responses as well. I know that's been conversation in Congress too, but at the state level, how are you seeing governments responding?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. As many of you may know, states are really leading the way on this issue. And in particular, for this conversation, 6 states have now banned PFAS in food packaging. Connecticut, Maine, Minnesota, New York, Vermont, and Washington. California will probably become the 7th state to ban PFAS in food packaging. And 2 members of Congress, Congresswoman Debbie Dingell and Senator Maggie Hassan, plan to introduce a national bill soon that would ban PFAS in food packaging nationally. All of these bills give food companies time to reformulate away from PFAS in food packaging. I should have mentioned in my bio, sorry, Savannah, that prior to being at EWG, I worked for the food industry. I was the head of government affairs for what used to be called the Grocery Manufacturers Association. So I have a long history of working on issues related to food. But then in addition to what states have done to address food packaging, they're actually going much further. So in particular, Maine just yesterday enacted a law that will require companies to prove that PFAS is actually necessary in your products. In other words, in Maine's law, under Maine's law, PFAS will be banned unless companies can prove that they have no choice to use PFAS, that there's no alternative to using PFAS. And the burden will be on the company, not the state regulator, to prove that use of PFAS is needed. And then Maine and several other states, Vermont, Connecticut, California, have also moved to ban the use of PFAS in firefighting foam. Not as probably as important to all of you, but if you're worried about PFAS, the PFAS that's been used in firefighting foam to fight jet fuel fires is one of the bigger sources of PFAS, especially around airports and military installations. And states are taking on other issues as well, including banning food packaging and everything from carpets and rugs to even ski wax, in the case of Vermont, where they obviously use a little bit more ski wax than they do down here where it's 100 degrees today in DC. And then I think the other sign that PFAS is really on the mind of a lot of policymakers is that even Congress is getting involved. And I know how much people love to give Congress a rough time. But Congress has already, 2 years ago, directed the Department of Defense to end the use of PFAS in firefighting foam. Next week, the full House will take up what's called the PFAS Action Act. This is a bill that sets deadlines for EPA to create a national drinking water standard for PFAS, to creates deadlines to regulate industrial discharges of PFAS, designates several PFAS as hazardous substances, which means that if they are improperly released, and there has to be a cleanup undertaken, that there will be they would have to, the polluter would also be responsible for cleanup. And then in addition to, and I should mention the PFAS Action Act will also includes a PFAS-free labeling provision, so that through the what's called the Safer Choice program. So there will be a way for companies to distinguish themselves in the marketplace by carrying a government-sanctioned PFAS-free label. Lots of other things going on in Congress, but in particular, there'll be more done in what's called the National Defense Authorization Act. That's the law that funds the Department of Defense to address PFAS. And of course, the Biden administration has decided to make PFAS a priority, and they'll be taking a number of steps to set a national drinking water standard to reduce industrial discharges of PFAS. I think the one part of the administration that's been really slow to act has been the Food and Drug Administration. We've petitioned, NGOs like EWG have petitioned FDA to ban the use of PFAS in food packaging. But FDA has been very slow to address PFAS and other chemicals that are used either in food or in food packaging. But back to you, Savannah. I'd love to answer your questions.
No, I appreciate all this information. And one final question I have around the legislative trends is around these 6, soon to be 7, hopefully, states that are creating PFAS-specific legislation. Which one would you consider to be a model bill, especially as it relates to food service packaging? So for us to explore as a resource that might be replicated in other states to come, which state do you feel like has the best gold standard? Or was one already a model bill that helped inform the other 6 to 7? Or I'm sorry, 5 to 6.
That's a great question. Well, Washington State was the first, but subsequently states have made important improvements. In particular, as more states have acted, they've taken steps to cover both plastic and paper. They've the compliance deadlines have grown sooner in time. I'm not sure there's a model. I think there are good features in all of these bills. So, but in the most recent ones that I would just encourage folks to take a look at, clearly Connecticut, Maine, Vermont are the bills that are probably the ones that I would start with if I were trying to answer that question.
Got it. I appreciate it. Thank you. And to your point around the labels, I think that's a great transition into this final segment of our conversation around taking action. It clearly PFAS demonstrates a threat to not only our environments but also our bodies. And I'd love for us to offer a couple of different solutions that we can all take, not only as representatives from the food service industry but also as conscious consumers. And the first that came to mind to me that I'd like to elaborate on from my perspective in the food service packaging industry and from compostables is identifying PFAS-free packaging. And actually Todd Evans, who I hope is on this webinar with us, when he signed up for this webinar, he asked how we can distinguish PFAS-free products from traditional fiber. I really appreciated that question. Thank you. And so from that, we can easily identify and prioritize PFAS-free packaging. And all you have to do right now with the tools that we have, and Scott, I'd love to follow up with a question with you on the federal labeling system, but for what we have right now in the compostable packaging industry, 2 great tools are third-party certifiers, labels, and they're actually working on the Biodegradable Products Institute, or BPI, one of the leading third-party certifiers in the United States for compostable packaging. They are working on a standardized labeling system across all compostable products that meet their third-party certifications, so that any consumer can quickly and easily identify and know that they are having compostable, 100% compostable food service packaging. Now, as part of that third-party certification, I think as of I want to say as of January 1st, 2020, was that as part of the third-party certification, you could not have any intentionally added PFAS in your packaging. The same goes for the Compost Manufacturing Alliance, or CMA. They are another leading third-party certifier, and they have the same standard that compostable packaging, to meet their certification, cannot have any intentionally added PFAS in their packaging. I say intentionally added because, to what Scott was saying earlier, because PFAS is so proliferated within our ecosystem and it's a forever chemical, there are opportunities where it's just literally in our environment, but intentionally added is incredibly important. So for those looking to identify PFAS-free packaging, look for one of those two labels. Now, if your fiber does not yet have, sometimes it's still a little bit difficult to emboss a third-party certification on a clamshell, for example. Go and see if you can find that brand of compostable packaging, and you can go to BPI, the Biodegradable Products Institute's website, bpiworld.org, I think, and you can type up that brand within their database, and you'll be able to see right there if they have that third-party certification. You can feel rest assured that it does not have any intentionally added PFAS in the packaging. Scott, I was curious, for that safer choice label at the federal level, would that transcend to food service packaging as well? Do you know?
You know, I think that is something Congress is trying to figure out literally as we speak. The PFAS Action Act will be on the floor next week. Members of Congress are, and Section 10 of the PFAS Action Act, you can, if you Google around and you especially go to the House Rules Committee site and look for HR 2467, the PFAS Action Act, you'll see Section 10 does not right now include food packaging as part of this new scheme to create a PFAS-free label. That's one of the things they're trying to figure out. And so, so I think we may, so stay tuned for next week, whether or not that will be part of what Congress ultimately includes in the legislation they'll be taking up on Wednesday.
Wonderful. We will definitely stay posted. And through this conversation, you have mentioned so many wonderful resources, both with EWG and others. You know, maybe even just in summary, what are some of those additional resources that the group here and others listening after this webinar is live that you recommend folks check out if they would like to learn more about this problem and the opportunities?
You know, I think obviously our website's full of great information. I will throw into the chat while we're talking some web links that I tend to share with folks when I'm, you know, when they're asking lots of questions about, especially about legislative opportunities to address PFAS. And here goes. There you go. A lot of resources in the chat there for folks. Especially on where is PFAS. So we've done some pretty remarkable maps, and in particular also who might be discharging PFAS. One of the really troubling challenges with PFAS is, while there's a lot of PFAS that's already in the environment, thousands of companies that are using PFAS or making PFAS are still discharging it into the water, into the air, sending it to our wastewater treatment plants. There's a map that shows that. The timelines that I popped into the chat show sort of what the government and manufacturers knew about PFAS and sort of their history of inaction. And then there are some blogs and reports that we've written that kind of highlight some of the policy choices that I've been talking about. So, and of course, I'll throw my email in the chat as well. It's just sfaber@ewg.org, and happy to take questions afterwards if folks want to follow up by email.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for all this information. And, you know, it's kind of just a final question for you from my end. In addition to resources to learning more, are there other ways that we as conscious consumers can take action or help advocate for some of the legislation that you've been talking about?
Yeah, you know, look, I mean, all of you who are watching this, I'm sorry to say, have PFAS in your blood. And some of you, if you live in Decatur, Alabama, or Newburgh, New York, or Parkersburg, West Virginia, or Bucks County or Montgomery counties, Philadelphia, in the Philly suburbs, some of you have 2 or 3 or 4 times as much blood as the national PFAS in your blood as the national average, and we can't avoid it, right? So these forever chemicals have been released into the environment since the 50s. They're forever chemicals, so they're not going away. They're incredibly mobile. They've been found on Mount Everest. They are in the blood of polar bears. They are everywhere. But you can reduce your exposure to PFAS. Certainly, as we talked about, you can choose household products that are not made with PFAS. That's easier to do when it comes to products like cosmetics, where all the ingredients have to be labeled, cleaning products, carpets, much more. Harder to do right now with food, obviously, because PFAS can be used in food packaging without having to be disclosed on the label. You can also choose to use water filters in your home that can reduce the amount of PFAS that's in your tap water. But at the end of the day, I'll just be really honest, it should not be the job of consumers to shop around the PFAS problem. Ultimately, we need states, we need the federal government to step in and set a floor for all of our consumer products, including our food packaging. And in particular, we need the government to do sort of 3 basic things. One is, we need to turn off the tap. We shouldn't be discharging more and more PFAS into the environment. We shouldn't make a big problem even bigger. We need to get PFAS out of everyday products. There's no good reason at all that PFAS is in our food packaging and our cleaners and our cosmetics and our sunscreens and myriad other household products. We don't need to get rid of every use of PFAS, but certainly we should reduce the exposures that put people at greatest risk. And then we need to clean up the legacy PFAS pollution. The government needs to set standards that water utilities have to meet before they send us our drinking water. And we need to clean up these big plumes that are flowing under the feet of our military service members and people living in host communities or people living near big industrial sites. So while there are lots of things that you can do in your daily life to reduce the amount of PFAS in your blood, and there's lots of evidence that shows that when we do reduce those exposures, that the amount goes down. It shouldn't just be on you. It shouldn't just be our responsibility as shoppers to solve this problem.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. And honestly, that does give me hope. And also what gives me hope is that there's clear evidence that when we have that type of legislation, that tap is turned off just about immediately. In May, there was an article about differences in European legislation. And I think in one of the countries, I'm not going to say which one because I can't remember off the top of my head. I want to say Denmark, but one European country had PFAS legislation and relative to another, and it was a chain restaurant that's in both areas. And in the area where there was legislation, they did not have PFAS in their packaging versus just over the border, there was. And the amount of PFAS in that area had dramatically been reduced. So it's really exciting to see that type of legislation at work and making a positive impact within those communities. And that means that we can do the same thing here, and just really appreciate these kinds of conversations. Thank you so much for your time. I feel like we're just about at the half hour, but I want to make sure there's space if there are any questions. Blair, on your end, Blair's our partner advocate. Is there 1 or 2 questions from the chat that you wanted to share with Scott and myself?
Yeah, so Juan had a great question about labeling. I think for the most part, that's been answered with some awesome resources, including, the BPI labeling, as well as the CMA, as well as EWG's great resource for, being able to scan a barcode right there in the store.
Thank you so much, Blair. And I couldn't agree more on that type of resource. There's so many when you go to EWG's website. And so with that, at the top of the hour, I'll just offer a massive, massive thank you to you, Scott, for giving your time to this conversation and helping us catalyze more conversation within the food service industry about this important topic. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll be creating a blog around answering some of the product-specific questions, personally from the Better Earth side. We've recorded this conversation, so it can continue to be there as a resource if anybody wants to come back and and check back into one of the questions or topics that we had been elaborating on, or if you want to share it with one of your colleagues that was unable to join us today. And we'll be following up with an email with resources in the days to come. So thank y'all so much for joining us. Thank you, Scott, for joining us as well and contributing to this conversation. And I hope everybody has a wonderful weekend.